Whose new book is called Civilization, the West and the Rest, and the writer and commentator Ziauddin Sadar, who's written extensively about Islam's relationship with the West. Very nice of you both to come in. Alan makes the point there that, 40 years of autocratic misrule are now coming to an end. The West's friends are going. As one commentator put it, have we built our house at the bottom of a volcano which is now spewing lava?
Well, I have to say that was a very classic example of the short-term perspective and history, because in reality, European empires, it wasn't just the British Empire, of course it was the French Empire as well, not to forget the Italians, really were quite a short-lived presence in North Africa and the Middle East compared with, say, the Ottoman Empire, which ruled over that region for more like 500 plus years. And when one's trying to understand the problems of the region, it's far more illuminating to talk about the long-term legacy of Ottoman rule than to talk about the relatively short-term impact of British, French or Italian rule, much less American influence, which has always been indirect rather than direct. So I think there's a real problem here with this kind of perspective, because we want to beat ourselves up and say, oh, it's all our fault, that these problems exist. But they're far more deep-rooted than the consequences of European empire.
But not our fault? Well, wrong to beat ourselves up?
You can't say it's the fault of imperialism and leave out the longest-living empire in the Middle East, which was the Ottoman Empire, Muslim empire, which went back much further than any of the European empires mentioned in that piece.
We're being called to the Ottoman empires,
we can certainly say it's the fault of the British imperialism. We can certainly say the mess that the Arab world is at the moment is a specific product of what the British did in the Middle East. Now, Neil is right that, of course, the Ottoman Empire was there for 500 years. But the legacy of the Ottoman Empire was almost wiped out by the British. Let's take the example of Iraq. The British decided that the Kurdistan mountains had to be there as a buffer against Turkey and Russia. So the Kurds were bombed, they were dispersed. Some of them went to Iran, some of them went to Iraq, some of them went to Jordan and various places. So they will be forever. So they will be forever fighting for a single nation
wiped
state.
Out, don't you? That the Ottoman Empire was wiped out. I mean, isn't it a question of whoever is strongest, whoever has the dominance, rules that part of the world? That's
let's be absolutely clear here. I mean, the culture that exists in the Greater Middle East and North Africa today bears very, very few resemblances to the culture that the Europeans tried to implant there, beginning in the late 19th century and carrying on through to the mid-20th century. It owes far more to the long-lasting impact of, say, Islam. Let's not forget that, which has had the biggest impact on the region of any empire. This seems to me the problem with arguing that it's all the fault of British imperialism. That's to misdiagnose the problems.
Well, let me just pick up on one of your quotes, Neil.
Point, which is slightly different, which is when you look at the problems that currently exist in a country like Egypt, they have far more to do with the ways in which those countries have been governed in the last 30 years than with anything that happened under British rule.
Precisely, I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. But the last 30 years have been dominated, essentially. First of all, there was a continuation of the British policy. You take Iraq, for example. Let me finish my example of Iraq. Saddam Hussein followed the British policies of bombing Kurds, of persecuting the Shia, and imposing Sunni majority rule.
But it wasn't the British policy to bomb Kurds.
The British bomb Kurds, yes. I mean,
that's a complete misrepresentation,
no, it's not a complete
history. I mean, there was an insurgency in the early 1920s in which air power played a part to bring it to book, but in reality, Saddam Hussein's policies owe virtually no debt to British imperial rule.
I'm going to bring us on to where we are now, because it is fascinating. You wrote today, or yesterday, I'm not sure, Neil, that only a Prozac-addicted optimist will put money on the emergence of Western-style democracy in the part of the world where we're now looking at revolution. Is that really what you think? It's just not going to happen?
Well, it's very unlikely to happen because the preconditions for successful Western-style democracies really aren't present. It is a big naive mistake to imagine that this is going to be like 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe, not least because the misrule that has characterized North African and Middle Eastern states, Arab states, over the last 30 or 40 years has left a very large part of the population very close to illiterate, relatively poor, unemployed. side, you have 20% of the population which is aged between 15 and 24, with a very high level of unemployment, low levels of literacy, and frankly, that is not the ideal setup for a transition to democracy.
Are you that pessimistic?
I mean, in fact, I'm totally optimistic. But the product, what we find in the Arab world today, unemployment, poverty, is the product of 30, 40 years of dictatorship that Britain has supported and promoted in many cases. For example,
I don't think you could say that Britain supported Nasser's regime, when, if anything, Britain tried to overthrow that regime.
But clearly, there were no efforts to get rid of Gaddafi. There were no efforts to get rid of Mubarak.
You'll be telling us in a minute that the Islamic Republic of Iran has been propped up by Western imperialism.
Anyway,
I mean, at what point are people in the region going to take responsibility for the defects of their own nationalist regimes that came into existence after the fall of British rule and are responsible for the poverty and chronic failure of these societies now? But these are not things you can blame on imperialism.
This is precisely what is happening now. The uprising is actually the Arab people taking responsibility for what has happened in the last 20, 30 years.
Do you think now do you think we are starting to see the decline of the West?
Well, that's part of the argument of my book. I mean, Civilization is a book that tries to cover 600 years of history, and it's a book that doesn't get hung up on the short-term issues that we're arguing about here. The long-term story of the last 600 years is that there's a remarkable surge which puts the West way ahead of the rest, including the Islamic world. But
is that to do with Islam?
Well, it's partly to do with Islam, because if you want to ask the question, why did the scientific revolution not happen in the Muslim world, it's largely because the clergy resisted it, and that's why the scientific revolution of the 17th century only happens in Europe.
To some extent, this is true.
Well, to a very large extent. Well, they prohibit, for example, printing in the Ottoman Empire for 200 years after it's general in Europe. And observatories are literally torn down at the behest of clergy. So if you ask yourself a much more profound question, which is not, whose empire did the most damage, but why did science only take root in the West in the 17th, 18th and 19th century and come very, very late indeed to the Muslim world? That seems to me a more illuminating question. But the big puzzle now is what happens next in a world in which demographically the West is in steep decline and will probably only account for about 10% of the world's population by 2050.
But I think, first of all, I must say that it is monumentally arrogant to actually call your book Civilization. In a sense, there is only one civilization. We must stop equating civilization simply with the West. There are other
certainly not what the book does. The book is a
other civilizations, India, China.
We're running out of time, Neil, so I'm going to cut to the chase. Who do you think will dominate? I mean, the answer to this is
we are going towards a
multi-civilization. Economically, do you think China can dominate without its own political revolution?
I think it's unlikely that we'll see anything like a Jasmine revolution in China inside 20 or 30 years. I think China will dominate economically. It may even dominate geopolitically. But remember, the Muslim world, which is nearer to us geographically, could dominate demographically because of the very high birth rates associated with radical Islam, which right now is the coming trend in that region.
I think the West as we know it would not exist in 20, 30 years' time if we live in a different world which will be dominated by China, India, and yes, if the revolutions in the Arab world are successful to some extent by the Muslims as well.
Thank you both very much indeed. That's clear. We've heard a lot from Benghazi in the east of Libya since its liberation.